Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Debbie Chen, the OCA Executive Vice President. I'm very pleased today to have joining us Jerry Vadamala, the Director of Democracy Program at AALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Kathy Fang, Director of Redistricting and Representation at Common Cause. Today's discussion is on redistricting and voting rights. So to start off with, would you mind letting us know a little bit more about the two projects that you guys work on, or programs, I should say? Jerry?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so many of you know we work with a lot of great OCA chapters, including Debbie's in Houston, on our Asian American exit poll and poll monitoring program, which we conduct every major election, including off-year elections. We started this program in 1988, and that was in response to the fact that the national media ignores Asian American voters, unfortunately. And we conduct the exit poll to get a sense of the Asian American electorate, to see what issues are important to them, who they're voting for. And our hope is that elected officials will then start paying attention to the community and responding to the needs of the community. It's also great real-time voter protection. At the same time we're polling, all of our volunteers are trained on voters' rights. So we look out for things that Asian American voters often face, being required to show ID when other voters are not, being required to prove their citizenship, if you can believe this or not, this has happened before, being segregated into Asian-only lines, and a whole bunch of other things. We're also looking out for language assistance and language access, which is a big part of our program. We also do a lot of redistricting work. We are in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Texas, and a few other places, working with local chapters and working with other community groups to make sure Asian American communities of interest are not divided at any legislative level. So many of you did great work on Census. This is that next step. We don't want to squander all the great work that we all did on Census, and make sure now the communities that filled out the census, and even if you didn't fill them out, we want to make sure that these communities are not divided, because it's going to last for 10 years. The next 10 years, good or bad, if the lines divide or keep our communities together, we have to live with them for 10 years. So that's the other big component of our program. We also litigate language access cases. We just settled a case with the city of Hamtramck in Michigan for failing to provide Bengali language assistance, which is required under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And that ties into the first project that I had mentioned about the exit poll and poll monitoring, to make sure language access is available to Asian American voters, because so many of them we know are limited English proficient.
And something I didn't say, earlier when introducing the two of you, is that you guys are literally the foremost experts in the entire nation in the AAPI community around these issues, right? Like AALDEF has been doing this, exit survey since the early 1990s. I know that many of our chapters were involved with that, as well as many other community organizations around the country. But like, you guys are the experts, literally. Kathy, would you mind telling us a little bit about what you're doing now?
Sure. So when last we met, I was working with what's now the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, and doing actually very similar work to what Jerry was doing in Los Angeles. And since then, I've moved on to work with Common Cause. And so in Southern California, we continue to do poll monitoring, and assist voters throughout the 5-county region around Los Angeles, Ventura, San Bernardino, Orange County. And we really saw an upsurge in the last set of elections where people were much more ready to engage in voter intimidation, and where some people were actively converting from being somebody on the outside intimidating voters to going on the inside and becoming a poll worker, and using that power to ask people, are you an American? Can you show me proof of citizenship? And sometimes sending people to the back of the line or sending them away illegally. So we've certainly, joined AALDEF in trying to block where that kind of voter intimidation and wrongful restriction happens, but also in some cases to litigate. The other thing that we spend a lot of time doing, and this is what I spend probably like 95% of my time doing, is working on redistricting. And there, what we're really doing, the starting point that I always say with redistricting is it is a ladder of engagement where the first three rungs were intentionally knocked out, and where those people who are in power gain and can reinforce their power, and they really don't want regular folks to participate. It is our job to build those three rungs back into the ladder so that people can participate. It is possible to participate. It's possible to make a huge difference. It's possible to get our communities drawn into districts that better represent us and give us our voting power back. But it's also the case that it is a process that was intentionally obscured so that people feel like, oh, that's a hard issue. It's an issue that I don't understand. It's an issue that is left up to experts. And so I'm going to focus on other things, right? Whether that's sort of day-to-day survival issues, or I'm going to focus on voting and registration, but not on that next step of redistricting. It's important because in the end, we have too many thousands of examples impacting on communities of color, but especially on Asian Americans, where our communities are cut up, are purposefully divided so that we don't have the ability to elect candidates of our choice, and ultimately where the outcomes of elections are preordained, not in our favor. So it's important for people to get involved.
So redistricting is complicated, right? And like when people ask me, well, what is redistricting? It seems like every other group right now wants to do some kind of redistricting training. And I usually just tell people like, well, you remember all the work we did last year of, for census, and, basically saying every person who got counted was worth, here in Texas at least, every person who got counted was worth $15,700 that came back to their community. And for most places around the country, it was around 10,000, give or take a little bit, right? Some places were like, I think it was Detroit was up at like 17 or 18,000 of money came back to their community if they got counted. And so then redistricting is essentially determining who gets to make the decision of how that money gets spent, right? Like who gets to be the policymaker. Would you mind explaining to us what really is redistricting, right? And all these different terms that I hear, like, unity mapping or opportunity maps, like communities of interest. If you guys wouldn't mind explaining to those of us who are new to this, right? And I would suspect for those of us who've been doing it for a while, sometimes those terms get used synonymously or different ways.
Yeah. Sherry, do you mind if I give the primer and then you give the communities of interest mapping detailed example? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if we can get the right screen. So we're going to start with the basics. This is a map of an imaginary, let me just pop it up, see if it'll work. There we go. It's an imaginary community made up of, I don't know, 20 people. And what you essentially do with redistricting is you count the number of districts that you've got to draw, and you divide that total number of people that you just got from the census divided by the number of districts. So here, if it's 20 people, you take 20 divided by 4 districts, and you get the magic number of 5. You're going to do that at every level of government. So if you're drawing a city council district, you're going to get the total number of people in your city, not the number of residents, not the number of people who are above a certain age, not the number of people who are citizens, the total number of people. You divide it by the number of districts, you get a magic number. That's your ideal number. We oftentimes talk about creating districts that are of equal population, or you'll see the phrase equipopulous. That is what that refers to. You're trying to create districts that have an equal number of people. So over time, of course, people move, people pass away, there are children who are born, and so you have that same district lines, but now some districts have more people, some districts have fewer, right? So what we try to do is then every 10 years, we count again, right? And we're like, okay, more people, but in different places. Where do they live? And then we start over again we redistrict that district. So now our imaginary community has 24 people. Again, do the math, 24 divided by 4 is 6. And so now you've redrawn those districts in a way where every district had 6 people, okay? Now, the key question on redistricting is where are you gonna draw those lines? Because depending on how you draw those lines, you could help or hurt a community. So here we have an imaginary community again, this time 16 people, and out of those 16 people, there's a minority community that happens to live sort of in the downtown area, but also in the south west area, kind of like Houston, and for Asian Americans anyways. And so let's say the incumbents come along and they're like, oh, that's lovely. We could just draw 4 perfectly square communities. You oftentimes hear this phrase, let's draw compact districts. Compact districts just means that the district is nice shaped, either square or circular or as close to that as possible. Doesn't necessarily mean anything other than I like the shape, but sometimes it's important to people that they do that. But what you can end up with is a community where that is split up into 4 different districts, and where, for instance, the Asian American community, because they're only 1 in 4 of each district, they have no ability to elect a candidate of their choice, and maybe they can't build the coalitions with other people who are in that district. So we have what's important, which is the Voting Rights Act. It looks at where minority communities are. It says where you can draw a district that is at least 51% of that community, and it has an ability to elect a candidate of its choice, right? That you should try to draw that. Now, the rules are much more complicated than that. I'm not going to get into it. It is important that if people get into district drawing, that they work with groups like AALDEF or AAJ or OCA, right? And that we're really kind of thinking through what the legal ramifications are. But in essence, if you were to think about where that community is, you could draw that district in a very different way. And here, by just paying attention to where the community is, you've created a district where, in this instance, hypothetically speaking, Asian Americans are at least 3 out of 4, and now they have a chance of electing a candidate of their choice. Mm-hmm. Now, there's always a question. Do you need 3 out of 4? What about if it's just closer to 51%? And a lot of that is why you want to talk with folks who've been thinking about it for a while, because you want to think about what's our regular turnout rate. You know, do we vote together, or is it many different ethnic groups where, you know, we're actually not voting in unison? We actually vote in very different ways, right? So it is important to think about that. And in a lot of ways, thinking about for Asian American communities where our similarities and differences are is the fundamental idea behind communities of interest. And I'm going to hand that over to Gary to talk about.
Great, thanks, Kathy. That was excellent. So I'm going to talk about the communities, right? Because you know, this is every 10 years after census now. As Kathy mentioned, the population has shifted, right? And we have to know where people are going. Some of you were paying attention when the apportionment numbers came out, right? On how many congressional seats each state was going to get, right? After looking at the census data. We still haven't received the redistricting data. Usually we have it by now, but the redistricting data gives us this detailed information on where people are and the racial background and all that. And we can use that when we're drawing districts. But the first thing we need to know is, you know, where are our communities located, right? And all over the country, we know different concentrations in different communities. A lot of places have Chinatowns, but not all. And then there's other ethnic groups. So I'm going to share with you a slide, documents that we had submitted last round in 2010, the 2010 cycle in New York. These are the Asian American, and I think Debbie had mentioned the term communities of interest. These are places that we believe there are actual communities, and we focused on Asian American communities that had shared similar concerns, right? And race was one of many factors that united this community. Linguistic, cultural, religious, socioeconomic, political, employment, housing. We looked at a whole bunch of different factors to see if there was a community that shared interests and concerns. Some of you may be familiar with Queens. This was what we came up with for Flushing. And when I say what we came up with, our process is we meet with community-based organizations that serve the community and literally ask, okay, where does Flushing start and where does it end, right? And if it's your community, if it's a Chinatown or whatever, you say, where does Chinatown start and where does it end? There's no right or wrong answer. This is what the community defines as their own boundaries, right? So there's no right or wrong answer. As you can imagine, some people have disagreements. Some people say it's the playground or it's the supermarket or it's the railroad tracks, and other people may disagree. It is usually an iterative process where we come to a consensus, and this is what we came to for this neighborhood. And you see, it's right down to the street, you know, the northern boundary, eastern, southern, western. At the time, we had the redistricting data. As I mentioned, we don't have that yet, but we then did the demographic breakdown. See, this is a very big community. Usually the communities are not this big, but this is 152,000 people. The deviation from the assembly size, this is at the assembly level we were looking at, and we had the demographic breakdown, right? And this is really important because we need to know where the community is before we can assess, okay, are we being kept together or are we being divided, right? We need to know that. We also ask, what are the surrounding neighborhoods that are most similar to your neighborhood that you'd want to be grouped together with in new districts, right? And it depends on what legislative district we're talking about, because they're all different sizes. So congressional usually is the biggest, right? It's several 100,000. And the last round, for at least for New York, it was over 700,000 people were in one congressional district. Then you work your way down. Usually the next biggest one is your state Senate district, then probably state assembly, and then city council. And it gets smaller and smaller. And if you can imagine this, the smaller the level, usually there's more opportunity for our community to be the majority. As you get to the larger sizes, like congressional level, it becomes more hard, even if you have a large population, to be a majority. But with this map, this guides us in how we're going to construct new districts. We also asked the community, the last question is, okay, well, what are the surrounding neighborhoods that are most dissimilar, right? You don't want to be grouped with, you know, whether it's completely, you know, the demographics are different, or it's a different school district, or it's different socioeconomic status. You know, they're more wealthy, we're more middle class and working class, whatever it may be. I'm sure you all can think of in your head, in your own neighborhoods, the surrounding neighborhoods that are dissimilar that you don't want to be grouped with. And this helps us in constructing new districts when we're drawing them. You see the next one, a Bayside, much smaller. And this is usually what we see in the case when we're meeting with community groups. They're much smaller, they're around this size, they vary in sizes, but usually gonna need more population to have enough population to have a district. That's why we need to know the surrounding neighborhoods. Last thing I'll show you, we did this for 15 different neighborhoods in Queens, Manhattan, and Brooklyn in New York City. We do this all around the country. And the way we are able to determine whether the community is being kept whole or divided is we superimpose the neighborhood boundaries over existing legislative district lines. So this blue line you see here, this was Flushing that I showed you in the beginning. And then this was Bayside, right? And then there's 15 different other Asian American communities of interest. Those are all the blue lines. We superimpose them over the then existing state assembly lines. And take a look here. Every single Asian American community is divided into multiple different districts. This one right here, it's Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, a South Asian Indo-Caribbean community of interest. Six different assembly districts. Elmhurst, Queens, 5 different assembly districts. This is usually where the light bulb goes off for most folks if they haven't learned about redistricting. Oh, this is why we don't have Asian American electeds at our local government. Because all the great work that so many groups do on voter registration, getting out the vote, voter protection, census, that all goes out the window if you don't have fair districts. Because think about it, if you get everyone out to vote and they're able to cast a ballot, well, there's still only a small percentage of each district. We can never elect a candidate of our choice if this is the lines that we end up with, right?
Yeah.
And the opposite is also true. the opposite is also true. If we're able to keep a community whole, well, then guess what? Then we are able to elect a candidate of our choice, and we usually do. I could tell you in New York, that's the only way we were able to get Asian American elected candidates. And they don't have to be Asian American, but the point is that the community can elect a candidate of its choice, whoever it may be. I'll just close with this on this point. We had to sue in federal court, like we did the last several cycles, to get fair lines in New York. And at the congressional level, the court actually drew the congressional lines, and they kept 5 Asian American communities of interest, as we proposed, in one congressional district, which was a plurality in that district, centered in Queens and Flushing. And several months later, New York elected the first ever Asian American to Congress from New York State. And a large part of that was because we finally had fair districts. And what you're seeing here is probably a good segue to the next point. I'm showing you the Asian American communities of interest. Well, what about the Latino communities of interest and the Black communities of interest? That's a big part of this. And I know a lot of people talk about unity mapping. And that's a big part of the work that we do. We don't want to be advocating just on behalf of our community at the expense of other communities. And we hope they would do the same with us. I know a lot of groups are collaborating now and have been with other communities of color that are protected under the Voting Rights Act. We have to make sure that we're coordinating. We know where the other communities are. So that's step one. Step two is a lot more complicated, and that's drawing actual districts that are legally compliant with all requirements, including the Voting Rights Act, that we can present as one unified map, which we call a unity map, which is a joint collaborative map of, for example, the assembly, what we're talking about here. We had an assembly map that was an actual full district configuration for the entire city of New York. And all the communities of color got behind it. So AALDEF worked with Latino organization, Latino Justice, PearlDef, formerly known as PearlDef, and the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, representing the Black community. So the 3 legal groups were at the table, and we had to go back to all our community-based organizations that we worked with to explain to them why we drew the map the way that we did. And then there was buy-in, right? And I don't know if that's going to be possible in all these places that are wanting to do this, but at the very least, we have to know these blue lines for the other communities so we can coordinate. And then if we're lucky, at the next step, we can draw an actual unity map, which would be one map that all the communities of color get behind and support. And that's really the goal in a lot of places. I don't know if we can get there, but I think we're in a good spot right now, at least where we're talking to the other communities to make sure we're not pitting ourselves against each other, which unfortunately has happened a lot in the past. And that's to the benefit of the incumbents who want to see us fighting each other. The biggest problem for them is when we're all unified and we're behind one map. And you might not get 100% of all groups behind one map, but if you could get most groups behind one map, it's very, very powerful. And we did that in New York, and we were very effective at increasing the amount of communities that were kept whole. And that resulted in more majority Asian districts, as well as Latino and Black community districts at all levels.
So, before I go into the takeaway, like the district that you mentioned, right, that resulted in Grace Meng, Representative Grace Meng. And, she rings a bell in my mind immediately because she was the first person to really speak out, in Congress about what's, all the anti-Asian hate incidents and just hate crimes that have been happening. And if she's the first, and only, AAPI out of New York, it kind of begs the question of like, had she not have been there, would it have been brought up as quickly as it did, right? And so like, to your point of the maps of wanting everybody to come together, it sounds like we really do need to have the legal groups there then to make sure that everything's compliant so that when these maps do get put forth, they're not going to be shut down, for not being compliant.
Right. No, it is important to make sure you have an actual map. And let me say this, it's great for groups to want to try and draw. For me, as one of the legal groups, the most effective communication with the groups is to give us this information about community boundaries, and describe their community to us, explain why it is a community of interest, all the shared factors, common concerns and characteristics, the surrounding neighborhoods that are similar and dissimilar, and then work with us, stay in communication with us as we're negotiating a unity map on actual district map. One thing I want to make very clear, and I hope groups that are thinking about drawing what we call a district in isolation, one district has very little use. It gets dismissed almost immediately, usually, because one district can, they just say, oh, well, if we did that, then it would affect the rest of the map and we wouldn't be able to comply with all the other requirements. It has very little value. You need to draw an actual whole configuration. And when you do that, okay, one, it takes a lot of time and a lot of expertise, but two, you have to make sure you know where the other communities are and you're not hurting them, right? The Black and Latinx community. So that's why to do a unity map, you need that coordination. And I would really urge groups to work with a legal organization like AALDEF or Advancing Justice or whoever it may be, someone that has the expertise to actually draw district configurations for an entire city at the very least, or an entire county or something like that.
So, I brought up, Grace Mang. What are other examples of, that you've seen, right, in the past? Because the first question that most people ask generally is, well, what's the big deal? I mean, what kind of impact are we really talking about here, right? What's something concrete that can really stick in people's mind? Because, it's one thing to say, well, yes, we did all this work and it'll go out the window, in terms of getting everybody counted.
Yeah.
But what's the actual tangible impact to people beyond just, oh, well, we elect, it determines who we can elect, and who gets to decide how the money gets spent. But what are some other, examples that you've seen of how it has benefited or, hurt us?
Yeah, I know that one of the examples that we talk about in California oftentimes is the example of Koreatown, where Koreatown was split into 4 different districts at every different level of government. And so back in the day when the riots happened and there was, unrest, a lot of the stores that were owned by Korean Americans were attacked and looted. And in the process of rebuilding, what the Korean American community asked for was small business loans and other kinds of support. And because they were split into 4 different districts, when they went to go talk to their legislator, very often they were bounced from one district to another. Each congressperson said, you're not really in my district. And so it was very hard for them to get any kind of support to rebuild. Meantime, they're constantly hit up for donations for people who are running for campaigns. So I want to share another example. Comes from my own backyard, and let me just see if I can get it to work out.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, this is back in 1982, and we're talking $1 billion plus worth of damage, right?
Right.
People's
right.
entire
92.
livelihood were destroyed.
It was 92.
Yeah.
92, I'm sorry.
92. So this is a zoom in of the San Gabriel Valley in Los Angeles County. Where you see the darkest greens, that's where Asian Americans are 60% or more, okay? So you can see there's a lot of places where Asian Americans are very, very populous. So for what was then Asian Pacific American Legal Center is now Asian Americans Advancing Justice, we spent a lot of time articulating why 4 cities, Alhambra, use my arrow if you can see it, Alhambra, Monterey Park, just to the south, San Gabriel, just to the east, and Rosemead, those 4 cities should be put together. Because at the time, we were not quite there in terms of being able to form a district where Asian Americans were 51%. We had to rely on a communities of interest argument. But here's what the communities of interest argument was, and I'll go into that a little bit in greater detail. We like to think about them as the 3 C's: culture, concerns and counts, right? So culture here, you have a huge Asian American population. It became the gateway for a lot of Chinese Americans in different generations, but particularly those coming from Taiwan and eventually from mainland China. It also became the gateway for a lot of other Asian Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Khmer, Thai. And part of the reason why it became a center was that in a lot of ways, this area, you had a lot of families who could support each other, right? And so it's a mecca for small businesses, particularly food and services. And once you come to a place where you can buy a newspaper in your language and you can go to stores where people serve the food that you know, then you're bringing other family in as well. Okay, so this area, as you can see, the red lines are how the district lines were drawn back in pre-2000. And the way the lines were drawn, you can see that this little area of 4 cities is actually split into at least 4 districts. Now, the reason why it was split in 4 districts is because we think down here in Monterey Park is where Judy Chu lived. And she had made a couple of runs to try to win this seat. And there was another incumbent who had decided that she really wanted to hold on to that seat. And so she was going to make sure that the district was drawn in a different way. And so at the Senate level, Monterey Park is actually split into 2, okay, between 2 different districts. And then there are multiple other districts that come down and scoop up a piece of this Asian American community. And all of that was partly so that Judy Chu would not have the ability to run for a Senate district. Now, we all know that since then, she's gone up and she's become a congressional member. But it took us not only articulating where the community was, but ultimately we changed the system so that now in California we have a Citizens Redistricting Commission that's drawing the lines, not just incumbents drawing their own lines. And the district at every different level now holds those 4 cities together. So at the assembly level, at the Senate level, and the congressional level. And all of that came about with people just starting by saying, where's my community, right? And for people who live in this area, you could say we're unified by boba shops or by bilingual signs on the streets. Our schools, a lot of people have fought very hard to make sure that there are bilingual folks at the front desk and that especially the newcomer kids get, classes where they can help to integrate and learn how to become part of this new country that they've moved to. That's not something that necessarily the surrounding areas invest in. And so there's a lot of things where on the concerns, we can kind of unify around to say, if we didn't have a single person representing us, we wouldn't have those concerns addressed, right? And in particular, now, with the rise of hate crimes, as you mentioned, Debbie, one of the biggest things is that these districts now come together to collaborate with across borders, to collaborate with our electeds to make sure that whether it's law enforcement or community groups or just leaders on the ground and neighborhood associations, that we're all coming together to talk about hate crimes and how we can kind of collaborate to make sure that our seniors are protected and that young people kind of have an identity that they can be proud of. And so we've been talking about teaching that curriculum in our schools. That's a huge change, and it's only possible because you've got somebody who is representing this area as a unified area, and this is the new district. Now, let me just say that we talked a little bit about the difference between kind of community mapping and then maybe I can pull this up, community mapping and then district mapping. So I think it's just useful to sort of see it as kind of how it flows from one to another. I'll pop this up. Okay. So community mapping is where we start. And I like to think of that, especially for people who live in sort of urban areas, that's your neighborhood, right? That's your, in Houston, Sandra and Southwest, right? In California, it might be, it could be a Chinatown, or it could be Berryessa, or it could be San Gabriel Valley, or it could be a specific part of San Gabriel Valley, which is like, let me talk about south of Mission, where you get a much higher concentration of Asian Americans. So people are going to have very specific notions of kind of what my neighborhood is. And thinking about that is really important because, and talking about that is very important because when you talk about your neighborhood, you're going to be the expert. You know, Jerry's not going to be able to come in and sort of be the expert on where your community is. Only you can say that. And only you can sort of say, this is what my neighborhood's like. And frankly, getting a group of people together who are your neighbors to kind of where is our community. Now, sometimes it's a little bit larger. I showed you, you know, a couple different cities that we have smallish cities in just east of Los Angeles where they share a lot of similar features, right? Both in terms of demographics, but also the concerns that we have. So we might come together and we might say, in addition to these many neighborhoods, we've got a slightly larger configuration that we think, you know, these are all communities that share similar concerns. Okay. Now, next thing that we need to think about is coalition building. This is key because for most places, Asian Americans, other than in Hawaii, we are not the majority, right? We're nowhere close to it. And so if we're going to have our voices heard, we need to be good bridge builders. Now, I don't need to tell most Asian Americans this because we already know it. And in most places, Asian Americans actually anchor the coalitions, which is something to be very proud of, right? I'll give a big shout out to Georgia, where Karuna Ramachandran runs the coalition coming out of Atlanta, right? Or in Minnesota, where May Yang runs a coalition of people who are learning how to tell the story of their communities and then coming together, right, between different communities and saying, hey, how can we work out maps that represent all of us? Okay. Third thing is district mapping. And that's where, now that you've figured out kind of where your neighborhoods or your small communities are, once you've figured out kind of where this community is and that community is, now you come together and you think about district mapping and what Jerry talked about in terms of unity mapping. Now here's where we put all those pieces together like a big puzzle, and we figure out, you know, where are the districts where you might have a larger concentration, for instance, of Asian Americans, and then maybe just to the east of it is our 3 districts that are Latino. But you have to work this out so that the Latinos have the representative number of districts, and then in areas where there might be some overlap, there's some active discussion. Sometimes it's hard conversations, right? But it's sort of an active discussion of how can we go in so that we have a unified front? Because if we don't go in with a unified front, for Asian Americans anyways, we are most likely to be left off of the table. We will not be discussed. We are oftentimes the sacrificial lamb. Sometimes it's active because somebody is afraid of an Asian American challenging them, as we saw in San Gabriel Valley. Sometimes it's just because you're an afterthought. You're like, I divvied it up for everybody else. Oh, did I not help you out? Sorry. So one of the key things that we need to do is make sure that we are getting involved first with community mapping, that we are involved in coalitions, and then where we can, we reach out to allies like Jerry at AALDEF to help us with district mapping. Last thing that I'm just going to say is that community mapping is something where these days, it used to be you kind of had to get somebody to come and help you out. These days, a lot of different groups, API Vote, Common Cause, AALDEF, we're all doing trainings where we can train you how to do community mapping, and there's now free software that's really incredibly easy to use. It's like it's a mix between Yelp and Google Maps. And if you can use those 2 apps, you can do the community mapping because you're just writing a review of your community. You're saying, this community has the best food, the best neighbors, right? This is why we're so special. And this is why you should come here. You're writing a Yelp review. And so for that reason, actually, most people, as a stepping stone, the first rung of the ladder that you should get involved in is that community mapping level.
Thank you, Kathy. One thing I would add, for those of us who are on the ground is that get asked is like, well, what can I do, right? Because to be involved with the community mapping process, sometimes takes a lot more time. But then it's those different hearings, assuming that we're able to have transparent hearings and the opportunity to actually comment on different maps that are, oftentimes put forth by the different levels of government. What we've been telling everyone is you can be involved by coming and testifying, right? The more people that come and testify, and especially for those of us in the AAPI community, it makes sure that we are, there at the table, that we are not forgotten.
Yeah, that's right. I will share a story, even though, sometimes the incumbents don't listen to you. Sometimes they do, right, when they're drawing the lines. And so I'll share the story of the Filipino American community in California, where they were split into two different districts. And there was an area of Filipino town in Los Angeles where basically right down the middle. They came together and they first started figuring out, like, what are the important places in our community that we want to identify. And they identified Union Church, which is where a lot of people first came and became and worshiped together. There are a couple of residential areas where there's, concentrations of Filipino Americans. There were a couple of restaurants and stores and community centers and nonprofits that they wanted to be all in this one area. After they identified that, and they essentially mapped it out, right? So lay a piece of paper with your map on it, and you're drawing it with a marker, a circle around it. A more higher tech version of that is some of these free mapping apps that we can talk about a little later. But once they articulated that, they started thinking about the stories, right? And so here, what I'll say is that, during the hearings, we had World War II veterans dressed in the uniforms that they fought together side by side with American vets. And they told a story about how before they came to the US, many of them marched in the Death March of Bataan, and where thousands of people died along the way, but they fought alongside with American soldiers on the promise that when they came to the US, they would be granted full US citizenship and recognition. And many of them came to this neighborhood of Filipino town to form a new community, to support each other. And they talked about how important this community was to them, because for many of them, they were homesick. They knew nobody, but here was a group of families that could share celebrations, the holidays, the language, the food, and they built a new life, right, for their next generation. And I will tell you that at that assembly meeting, when they told that story, there were tears running down the eyes of several of the assembly members, right? Just thinking about kind of how important this neighborhood was to them. And then when they said, here's where we are, and they showed the map, and they showed, here's the district line that draws right through us, that was very impactful. And the assemblywoman who heard that testimony insisted in the backroom conversations, we need to make sure that we put that community whole. For her, is an issue of integrity. So many times, if your interests align with those of the incumbents, or they're hearing you, or maybe you live in a state where there's a commission, it really makes a difference to tell that story. Because here's the difference. If you didn't tell that story, nobody knew. Nobody knew where the beginning and end of your community was. They didn't know a line was drawn through you. They didn't know what the impact was, that you were split between two districts. And so when you wanted to, for instance, make sure that you had a sign that said Historic Filipino Town, designating your area so that there could also be economic investment, nobody knew that that was a thing. And so they drew the line where they did. Once they heard the story, they recognized it. And from there on out, having those maps of where your community is served so many different things, right? Including the fact that they were designated a historic area, including the fact that small business loans now were invested into the area as a way of building up the economic integrity of that neighborhood. And in many ways, it became on the map for the city and the county and the state. So small things, just telling the story of our communities, can have such a huge impact in redistricting as well as in other arenas.
if I could just add also that it's a great return on investment to spend an hour. Usually that's all it takes. We'll have an hour to an hour and a half with your to map out the boundaries, and you tell us everything about your community beyond race. Race is one of many factors. It's very, it's not compelling when you say just keep all the Asians together without more, right? Because we're going to have that data. We're going to have the redistricting data in a few weeks where we know where everybody is. The reason we're asking you is you're giving us much more context beyond just where all the Asian folks are. And your community usually is not just only Asian. Also, there's usually other groups that are there, and you may have worked together on certain things. But we want you to give us that context, that flavor of the neighborhood, and then once we have that, and you tell us the surrounding neighborhoods and that are similar, dissimilar, that's good for the next 2 years. And it's such a useful tool because, one, as Kathy mentioned, it gives a roadmap and say, hey, here are the building blocks to draw new districts, just with that information from that hour and a half conversation with us. And then any plan that comes out, we can analyze to see if it's good or bad for our community. So that first step really is the biggest step, and I think the most important step. And it's not meant to be a big lift for community-based organizations. We know you're working on a million different things. You're stretched very thin. And sometimes it sounds daunting when you hear the whole process, like, oh, we can't devote all this time to that. But it really is as short as an hour and a half, and then a few other meetings to make sure we show up at the and testify together. And then we'll have some, a few isolated meetings throughout the course of the redistricting process, which is the next year or two, including local redistricting, where we'll continue to use those maps. I'm showing you maps from 10 years ago, and Kathy and Debbie have seen it numerous times, and this is something you can use. Yeah, you can use over and over again. It's very a valuable tool that we can use to discuss how good or bad we're doing.
I will say you can go to your registrars and say, we need a voting center here because we're a community, right? You can get economic investment. So being able to sort of show maps of your community and put all that testimony together is so impactful on redistricting, but it's also so impactful on so many of the other issues that we care about, right? Here's a small example, in Long Beach, there's a community of Latino and African Americans that talked about how they live very close to the ports. And one of the largest impacts is, yes, it's a producer of jobs, but it's also a producer of 18-wheeler truck traffic that drives through the neighborhoods 24/7, and where they have some of the highest incidents of asthma. And as a result, they have very high hospitalization rates of very young children who are going to the hospitals because they can't breathe. Being able to connect that story then to, that's why those communities that are impacted by the freeways leaving the ports ought to be in the same district as the one with the port, was incredibly important to putting that all together. So now, right, the legislator who represents that area is thinking about how to make sure to pass environmental requirements that are emitting all of that exhaust can be refitted, right, with things that kind of ameliorate the air. And what's really important is then they can also invest in dollars that go to local hospitals to be able to serve the kids who have asthma or the families that have people with asthma. And they're also investing in education at the K-12 level so that teachers know to watch out for this, right? So it's sort of, when you think about the kind of impacts that your neighborhood might experience because of where you live, it can trickle down through policy at all different levels, right? And this is an example of a community that might be unified by race and the income level, but you could also talk about the impacts of the kind of jobs that they have and the kind of investment in health remedies that could help them make sure that they don't have that significant rate of asthma and cancer. So types of it gets so much deeper, and being able to tell those stories is really important. I'll say one last thing, which is this is the year that redistricting happens. It's been stretched out a little bit until. It's also the year where a lot of media want to hear stories of redistricting. And Common Cause and groups like AALDEF and OCA are working really hard to change the narrative. So the way that redistricting usually gets covered is it's always about telling the story of one incumbent versus some other incumbents and a battle between parties or political operatives, right? It's an insider story. What we want to change the narrative to say is, no, this is a story that impacts real communities. We want to lift those up. And the media are actually hungry for these kind of stories. Now, can we find more stories like Long Beach or Koreatown or Queens to be able to give to media so that they spotlight it and they say, wow, look, here's a community. It's very vibrant. Here are the things that bring them all together, but they're split, right? Or they're put into a district that makes no sense, or they're, in some other way, robbed of their political voice. Putting you on the map using media is incredibly important. And we're starting to create a bank of those stories so that we can lift them up. So you're not only telling that story to the electeds or the commissioners who are drawing the lines, you're not only collecting those stories so that you can create maps so that you can have policy change in the future, but you're also telling those stories to the media so the rest of the world knows about your community. That's incredibly important. So any of those, if you've got stories as you're doing this kind of community mapping and you want to bring us in to say, hey, would you lead a workshop so we can get started? By all means, contact Jerry or myself. We'd be happy to work through Debbie to make that happen. And then the other piece of it is once we've collected some of those stories, we want to put them into a shared bank so that we can give them to reporters who are hungry for covering a story and telling, that unknown community that never had a voice, but now we have a few leaders who have put something amazing together in terms of a political campaign to try to get their community represented in a district.
Speaking of contact, would you mind sharing with us your email addresses?
I'll start. So, Kathy, I guess you can see my name in the
chat. Hopefully, the recording
in the chat, but I'm also typing it out. So it is kfeng@commoncause.org. So that's kfeng@commoncause.org.
Great.
And mine is it's J Vadamala. Everyone knows how to spell that, I'm sure. Just okay, J V like Victor, A T like Tom, T like Tom, A M like Mary, ALA at AALDEF. That's AAL, D like David, E like Edward, F like Frank .org. J Vadamala at AALDEF.org.
Great. Lastly, I just wanted to ask you guys, what do you think of what's going on now with all the voting suppression type of bills being, passed, right? Like, how is this, going to have long-term impact on, essentially us having representation?
Well, I would just say, some of you that have seen me speak before, many times I try and say this on redistricting presentations. In my view, redistricting is the most effective voter suppression tool out there. And there's a lot of reasons for it. One, a lot of times it's under the radar. Folks don't know what's going on. There's deals being made in back rooms. The lines come out and, if you ask a lot of, people on the street, who your rep is or what the district lines are, people don't know. But these lines, as I showed you earlier, every single one of the Asian American communities, the 15 that I showed you in New York City, every single one was divided into multiple different districts, some as high as 6 different districts or 5, right? And that has really impacted our ability to elect a candidate of our choice without even having to do one voter suppression tool outside of that, right? So it really, really subverts the population in our community right out of the gate. So if we don't have fair districts, we're playing catch up already. And now on top of that, with these voter suppression laws, we're looking at them and, we try and think strategically, where do we get involved? And so when we're looking at, okay, what's going to impact our community? We're looking at, voter purges of naturalized citizens. We see that in Texas, right? Where, hey, they tried to do this a few years ago. When you went for your driver's license, if you indicated you were not a citizen, but now you're on the voter roll, even if that was 10 years ago, well, guess what? We're gonna try and purge you, and then we're gonna make you have to prove that you are in fact a citizen, even though you did that when you registered to vote. So, targeting naturalized citizens, which disproportionately affect Asians and Latinos, targeting voter assistance, right? We know under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act, we litigated a case in Texas under this provision where you can bring somebody with you if you need them to translate for you and interpret for you. So many Asian Americans rely on this provision. They bring their children or grandchildren or anybody else. Laws that are targeting that assistance, we're focusing on that. On voting by mail, we know so many Asian American voters voted by mail in this past presidential election and plan to do so again, whether it's through absentee ballot voting or if you are in a state that does vote by mail. And the other big thing that we're looking at are these laws targeting what they call vote harvesting or ballot harvesting, where, a group does a voter registration drive. They have all the voter registration forms and they just collect them all and they drive them down to submit them all at once. We know so many groups do that. I know it's really big in Native American communities where they have real problems with access. I know a lot of our community also. Those are really disturbing because, it's not based on any actual voter fraud. It's only perceived, by some of these legislators that, oh, there's a huge problem with voter fraud that we need to address. And when they're pushed to show any evidence, they usually have none. And the Supreme Court recently said, well, that's okay, as long as it's a small enough group of people that you're disenfranchised or making it more difficult to vote. Well, I guess that's okay then. And they're really making it more difficult for us to challenge these laws, right? By getting rid of preclearance, which was really the most effective tool for our communities in preventing these voting laws from actually taking effect. That is now gone. That was gone since 2013 because of the Supreme Court ruling in Shelby v. Holder. And just recently in the Brnovich decision at the Supreme Court, they really are narrowing the tools that we have, and they no longer need to really show actual fraud that they're passing these laws in response to, allegedly. And if you're disenfranchising or making it harder to vote for some folks, well, Justice Alito and the majority there think, well, that's okay, as long as you're actually able to do it somewhere else in another manner, even though it may be more difficult. So they're starting to really, make it almost impossible for us to bring these challenges and win, and make it easier for state legislatures to disenfranchise or make it harder to vote for some groups and leave other groups alone. So it's really concerning. We're going to try and fight as hard as we can with groups like OCA and all the chapters or other groups that are willing to serve as plaintiffs for us in these litigations to make sure we can knock them down. But it's just another, just added to the list of voter suppression tools that are already there. And in redistricting, that's why we have to fight like hell to make sure we have fair districts, and then fight these voter suppression laws as they come to us. It's a real disgrace. I mean, all these things are just subverting democracy, and we have to do our best to fight back against them.
So all the more important for us to try and get fair maps.
Let me leave off on maybe a slightly more positive note, because I think that what Jerry is saying is absolutely true, right? That redistricting, and let's be clear, redistricting itself is neutral, right? But how people use it can be incredibly hurtful of our communities. And so it can be used in a way where the lines are manipulated to cut up our communities or to disenfranchise us. And in that case, then I usually call that gerrymandering. But what I'll say is that this is a tool, just like any other tool. And whether you choose to use it to protect communities or to cut them up is really sort of a matter of who holds the power and whether or not we step up to the plate. So with voting, it's just a little bit more obvious where if we come out to vote and we mobilize people, we can have a huge impact on elections, which is why we see this upsurge of restrictive voting laws, right? These anti-voter laws popping up in Texas and Georgia and Arizona, because there are people who believe that the election outcomes are impacted when, quote unquote, too many people show up to vote, right? So redistricting in many ways is the same way, except that once the fix is in, it's a lot harder to overcome with huge voter turnout. So there we need to actually see much more fundamental reform. I'm sure that people are very, very familiar with HR 1 and S1, the For the People Act. Fundamental in that, you know, in addition to sort of allowing for greater access to the ballot and registration and, you know, sort of more consistent rules about how ballots should be provided, there are also rules about redistricting. And those rules would create a baseline in terms of how the maps have to be drawn, who would draw them, and the timing of them, right? That would essentially level the playing field for everyone, right? And that's really, really important. Now, I'm just going to share one last slide, which is what might happen for the rest of the country would HR 1 For the People Act get adopted, especially with the particular provisions on redistricting that are there. So this is a chart of California before we had a commission. And prior to 2008, we didn't have a commission. And so our percentage numbers of Asian Americans in the congressional delegations for California hovered around just under 6, right? We got a whopping 2 people in the congressional delegation. And then what happened was that after the commission was created, which HR 1 For the People Act would allow, let's see if I can make my graphics work, it grew. And that growth, sorry, was phenomenal. And this is the after. The congressional delegation grew from 6% to 13%, right? And these are all the people who were elected to seats that were drawn by the Redistricting Commission. Not because the Redistricting Commission was necessarily trying to draw districts that were putting a thumb on the scale for Asian Americans, but because they were just trying to draw the districts based on demographics and testimony of what people were telling them. And in doing so, by leveling the playing field, Asian American candidates had a much greater chance of running for office and then winning. And so by 2018, we had 13% of the congressional delegation, which is where we ought to be based on our state population. It's pretty phenomenal, like to see that many Asian Americans get elected in the course of 1 decade. And so it's significant when we think about the possibilities for change to understand that we have on the table right now, not a hypothetical bill, but the For the People Act. And if we can, you know, lean in to whoever our elected representatives are, to let them know that it's incredibly important, to express our support for it, it could pass, and that would be a game changer for voting rights and for redistricting. And so I would just leave off that I know that OCA is a strong supporter of this bill as well as many other voting rights bills. This is an omnibus bill that changes things. It would change, you know, the money advantage that some people who are insiders have. it would change voting rights and the access to registration and the ballots, and it would change redistricting, making sure that lines are drawn in a way that is inclusive and fair, and not just the province of people who are trying to protect their own power.
And if I just make one point that Kathy started to make there about, with not putting the thumb on the scale, it's not asking, we're not asking for special treatment or to be in an advantageous position. We're asking to be put in an equal position, an equal opportunity to elect candidates of our choice, an equal opportunity. And that's the messaging. And that truly is what we are trying to do. Why can't we be treated like other communities, right, that are able to elect a candidate of their choice? And it's hard to argue against that, right? And as you look in the background, Kathy's background, reading your side, this is not political. You notice we didn't really mention Democrat, Republican. I mean, this is a human basic right, a voting rights issue that it's not really nonpartisan. I mean, it's really nonpartisan, right? That electing a candidate of the community's choice, regardless of who it is, that's the goal here, and to be put on equal footing with other communities. Because we're not there yet. A lot of places we're not there yet. I mean, California is a great example of what's possible at the congressional level. But you saw what was happening before that independent commission was formed to remedy all those things, right? So many of our communities were divided, sometimes on purpose, so that we couldn't elect a candidate of our choice. And it was very, very effective. And it didn't have all the headlines of these big voter suppression laws, right? It was really under the table.
Right. People didn't understand why, how can we turn out so many people, but we still can't seem to elect a candidate, that we wanted. And the reason why was because that district was not drawn for that candidate, right? And until we have that level playing field, and we can be assured, particularly for the Asian and Pacific Islander communities where we are the fastest growing, we're also moving into spaces where our communities were not before. That kind of changing demographics is very hard for the current political establishment to understand and respond to. And so you really need to have rules that say, no, you got to pay attention to that growth. You've got to pay attention to those new communities. You've got to pay attention to communities that may not already be at the table because they don't have an elected already. And as with so many other things, our political systems are created to protect power and to reinforce, the racism that exists in our country. But I do believe that, many of us are leaders in this movement and changing it. And I'll just give a quick shout out. I mentioned before that we've got some people who lead the coalition in various states that you wouldn't necessarily think about, right? From Minnesota and Georgia, to be led by Asian American women is kind of amazing. But also places where big reforms have been passed, like Michigan, that's led by an Asian American woman, Nancy Wong. So we are at the forefront of reshaping redistricting, whether it's through litigation and what Jerry does, or it's through legislation and changing the laws of redistricting. It is Asian Americans who are leading that way, in part because I think for so long we understand the importance of building a democracy that lives up to what our moms and dads and people who came before us had a dream of, right? And so in some ways, I think it is our communities that hold on to that notion of that ideal, even more than many other people who I think, may have lost the dream and or don't believe that it's possible. I think there are a lot of people who, like myself and Jerry, we're still a little Pollyannish, and we're willing to try to fight for a system that's better for all and not just for some.
Well, it takes a little idealism, right? This is
It does.
this is not the, sexy, popular work that's easily seen. This is, long-term work, and, it's not always the most supported, but it's so important. So on that note, thank you both so much for taking out time in your day. I mean, literally, you guys are the foremost experts in the country on this area and have been working on this for decades now. And we'll continue to do this. So, that idealism and passion is really deeply appreciated by all of us. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you all. And please reach out to us if you haven't already. If you haven't
Yes.
started that community map, like I said, it's great return on investment. So we need you in this fight.
Yeah.
Please join us.